Reconstruction offered to fulfill the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, backed by substantial public policy in the form of constitutional amendments and statutes to ensure their enforcement. The rise of Black power was a profound threat to the superiority of white people in the South. They now found that people they had once owned were holding public office. No longer in the control of governmental structures, the white people turned to vigilantism. Founded in 1865, the Ku Klux Klan extended into almost every southern state by 1870 and became a vehicle for white southern resistance, as did other vigilante groups. In January 1871, 500 masked men attacked the Union County Jail and lynched 8 black prisoners. In 1873, one of the worst massacres occurred in Colfax, Louisiana. African Americans had essentially won control of the local government there, and whites decided to take it back. Historians aren't sure how many people died in the end, but records show that the massacre resulted in the deaths of perhaps 3 white men, and it is estimated anywhere from 60 to 150 African Americans were killed. Vigilante murders of African Americans would continue on a large and small scale even until the current time. After the Civil War, the U.S. banking system grew rapidly and seemed to be on solid ground, but it got hit by a number of banking crises. The worst was 1873. The panic started with a problem in Europe, and then the stock market crashed. Investors began to sell off the investments they had in American projects, particularly railroads. Back in those days, railroads were a new invention, and companies had been borrowing money to get the cash they needed to build new lines. Railroad companies were borrowing on bonds, and Europeans started selling their bonds, and soon there were more bonds for sale than anyone wanted. Railroad companies could no longer find anyone to lend them cash, and railroads began to go bankrupt. One of the biggest banks in New York City, J. Cook Company, had invested a lot in the railroads, and when they started having problems, so did J. Cook and Company. It went bankrupt. When people saw that such a large bank could fail, they began to run to their banks demanding all their money back. The panic spread to banks in Washington, Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, and Georgia, as well as banks in the Midwest, including Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. Nationwide, at least 100 banks failed. Northerners became consumed with economic concerns, and they lost interest in equality in the South. In 1874, Democrats, sympathetic to the South, took control of the U.S. House of Representatives. Republicans, desperate to hold on to the presidency, sacrificed freedom and equality for African Americans. The 1876 election was much closer than the 2020 election. Democrat candidate Samuel Tilden, governor of New York, led by 260,000 popular votes, but was one electoral vote of winning the presidency. Returns were contested in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Congress created an electoral commission to actually decide who would win. And the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes cut a deal to secure that win. He agreed to remove federal troops from the South. This enabled the white supremacists to return to power and began disenfranchisement of African Americans and a reign of terror. The final blows to equality came from the Supreme Court. In a series of cases in the latter quarter of the 1800s, they overturned most of the post-Civil War progressive legislation. They limited the reach of the 14th Amendment. They said that the federal government could not act to protect African Americans from violence, that was a state responsibility. They overturned the act that shut down the Ku Klux Klan, ruling it unconstitutional. They overturned the law that granted equal treatment in public places. Voting rights denied in Mississippi based on poll taxes and literacy tests were approved. In Alabama, 5,000 African Americans sued for the right to vote, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was powerless to intervene, even if a state violates the 15th Amendment. The hope for equality after the Civil War ended in 1896. Louisiana, by that point, was requiring railway cars to be segregated. In 1892, Homer Plessy, who was mostly white, 7/8, but black under Louisiana law, agreed to participate in a test case. He sat in a whites-only car, was asked to leave, and was arrested. At trial, Plessy's lawyers argued the act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments, but the judge found that the railroads could segregate under state law within the state boundaries. Plessy appealed to the Supreme Court, which also found the state law was constitutional. In a 7-1 decision, the court upheld segregation. Justice Brown, pictured here, conceded that the 14th Amendment intended to establish absolute equality for the races before the law, but he held that separate treatment did not imply inferiority of African Americans. In short, segregation did not itself constitute unlawful discrimination. He wrote that in the nature of things, the 14th Amendment could not have intended to abolish distinctions based on color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality or by a commingling of the two races unsatisfactory to either. In dissent, John Marshall Harlan argued that the Constitution was colorblind and that the United States had no class system. Accordingly, he said all citizens should have equal access to civil rights. He remained in the minority opinion for decades. The U.S. clearly had a class system, institutionalized by the Chief Justice and his accomplices.